The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Leon Charney Report. We have a really eclectic and exciting show tonight.
So my new novel is How Sweet It Is, with an exclamation point. And for people of a certain age, they'll remember that was the old Jackie Gleason line, How Sweet It Is. And the novel is set in Miami Beach in 1972. And people might remember that throughout the 1960s and very, very early 70s, Miami Beach was very much identified as the place where Jackie Gleason actually filmed his variety show on Saturday night. He used to begin the show with saying, "Come on down," the idea that to allure New Yorkers and people from the Northeast to Miami Beach. And he was sort of the crown prince and also the city clown in its own way, sort of a hero. He owned it. And in the novel, he almost narrates it. And he brought to Miami Beach his friends. Sinatra was in Miami Beach throughout that decade and early 1970s. And Sinatra's in the novel. Jackie Gleason is in the novel. Muhammad Ali is in the novel. Meyer Lansky is in the novel. Isaac Bashevis Singer is in the novel. And the idea is that in 1972, all of these people were in Miami Beach for very different reasons. They didn't know each other, but in the novel, they know each other. They're all interacting in one novel. And it's very much like the E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime. It's very similar in that way, where the novel is really about ragtime and the famous people who populated New York City in the early part of the 20th century. How Sweet It Is really about Miami Beach in 1972 and the historical characters that happen to be there. Now, what they do in the novel is very fictionalized. I mean, I have no knowledge of whether, Fidel Castro makes an appearance in the novel also. I can assure you he wasn't in Miami Beach in 1972, but the novel opens up the possibility that he might have snuck in occasionally. So the plot is something that is fully fictional, but the characters were all there for different reasons. And the city, by 1972, had lost its luster. It was no longer a great tourist destination. People were going other places, going to Europe. It was now no longer a place to spend their time. The city was somewhat frayed at the margins. The hotels were a little shabby. Meyer Lansky's Jewish Mafia had lost a lot of its strength.
That's true.
Largely because he lost his casinos to Castro, and he wanted to find a way to rebuild his empire. And the way he tried was to bring gambling to Miami Beach. As we know, that didn't happen. Instead, it went to New Jersey. Gleason just lost his television show a year or two before, and he too was in his low point. Sinatra had just recently retired for the first time. Muhammad Ali was making his comeback after having lost to Joe Frazier after coming out of prison for his draft evasions. And the novel is really about this. It's a Valentine to the city of Miami Beach, because 1972 was a historic year in Miami Beach and around the world. That, first of all, Miami Beach hosted both the Democratic and Republican conventions in 1972. No city had ever done that. And this, remember, was just 4 years after the Chicago riots, after the Democratic Convention in 1968. So the idea that the city of Miami Beach could host both conventions within 6 weeks of each other and without the counterculture rioting throughout the city was really quite an incredible achievement. Yeah, Sinatra and a number of what was then the Rat Packers, Sammy Davis Jr., Dean Martin, Milton Berle, they all appeared at the Eden Rock, at the Fontainebleau, the Deauville, sometimes at the Diplomat, which was not in Miami Beach but north. So some of those hotels had top flight, top shelf entertainment. But by 1972, again, it was losing its allure. Well, that was another thing that happened in 1972. There was in Miami Beach. There was the beginning of the counterculture, which had come down with these conventions, and there was also the very beginnings of forced integration, busing, school busing, which had already come to other places in the Deep South. But Miami Beach was never really the Deep South. You know, in some ways, it was the deepest South you can go, but it was really somewhat like the Northeast. And so in 1972, you started to see busing. And the very beginnings of that, they started first sending the black teachers over the causeway to teach Jewish kids in the elementary schools and junior high schools of Miami Beach. And the causeways were 5 miles long. And so there was sort of a reverse busing where the teachers themselves first started coming over, and that they started integrating with teachers first, and then they started integrating with African American boys, and it required, you know, a very complicated way of bringing people over the causeway and making sure that everyone got to school on time, and it was very much symbolic of the historic relationship between blacks and Jews. You know, they've had a common history of persecution. You know, in the novel I point out that many of the hotels in Miami Beach, one in particular, the Kenilworth that was owned by Arthur Godfrey, had a sign that said blacks, Jews, and dogs not allowed. And so blacks and Jews and dogs were always very much, you know, tied together. Yeah, in the novel I point out the irony that even today 41st Street is Arthur Godfrey Road, which is really the middle of the city, and it's been named, you know, for a person who at the time was widely regarded as an anti-Semite, who owned a hotel, who refused to cater to Jews and blacks and dogs. But during this era of 1972, you had forced integration and busing, and it was, you know, a tentative alliance between, you know, two people that had their own civil rights struggles in the United States. And many people remember that Jews were very much at the forefront of the civil rights movement. You know, Rabbi Heschel marching arm in arm with Martin Luther King. A number of Jewish lawyers were responsible for creating the the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. You know, here these Jews and blacks were tossed into school together, very largely unaware of that history, and, you know, developing their own, you know, early alliances and complications. So in the novel, I also create the idea that there was which was actually happened, that there were many Holocaust survivors that had been professors before the war who could not get jobs teaching at Northeastern universities and ended up teaching at the historic black colleges in the Deep South. In fact, there was a documentary about this years ago of these, you know, Frankfurt-educated Jewish professors teaching in all black colleges in the Deep South. And I picked up on that theme and brought in the world's fastest man, Bob Hayes, who's in the novel, who was also in Miami Beach in 1972 because he played in the Super Bowl. So there was an attempt really through this book, How Sweet It Is, to tell in some ways the history of the United States, history of Miami Beach, the history, Jewish history, black history, all of that year, which was in fact a very historic year. And of course we know 1972 was the Summer Olympics in Munich, which represented two things to American and world Jews. One was Mark Spitz becoming the greatest Jewish athlete in the world in 1972. And within less than 2 weeks later, the entire Israeli team had been murdered. It was an amazing, you know, moment in not just world history, but for global Jewry, from the height of having such sense of an ethnic pride in a Jewish boy from Los Angeles, you know, winning 7 gold medals. In 1972, the Olympics came back to Germany. Many people remember 1936, Hitler hosted the Olympics in Berlin and was embarrassed because his sense of Aryan superiority lost to Jesse Owens, mostly, who became the sort of the leading figure of the 1936 games. But it was supposed to be a showcase for Nazism and the master race, and instead you saw what Hitler would have described as a subhuman, an African American, winning all of those gold medals. 30 some odd years later, 35 years later, 36 years later, the Olympics comes back to Germany. This is after the Holocaust. Germany is in its own post-war rebuilding period, and they want to show that they are now back as a relevant and important country in the world. And then, the two things are most remembered about that Olympics. One was that, Mark Spitz set this record, and he was Jewish, which there was some poetry to that a Jew would come to Germany and would win all of those medals, the home of the place where, where 2 out of 3 Jews throughout Europe were killed through the madness of the Nazis. But then Israel, which at that point was still a very young country by 1972, this was I think you would know this better, Leon, than I would, but it was the most significant and certainly the most controversial act of terrorism at that time. I think it was 13 athletes, 12 athletes, I can't remember the total number. It's in the book. I think one athlete escaped. He ran out out the window. But it was the first act of terrorism that the world, I think, they had seen hijacking of planes and cruise ships. The world had seen some of that throughout the 1960s and early 70s. But the killing of the Israeli team by Black September, which was the name of the PLO group that conducted this murderous act, that all happened in the same games. And they didn't cancel the games. The games continued, and the Israelis then went about their efforts to not only once again call attention to global terrorism, but also their own retribution, which was somewhat depicted in somewhat historical way in the movie Munich by Steven Spielberg. Well, the book, many people always ask about whether my novels are autobiographical. I mean, they're not. The core themes are real. I was a child of Holocaust survivors, and I grew up in Miami Beach, and my parents died when I was young. All of my novels deal with post-Holocaust themes, and all of those characters are children of Holocaust survivors, and all of them have complicated relationships with their parents who were survivors, and there's a traumatic legacy to that experience. But the core theme is autobiographical, that I know the emotional experience of being a child of survivors, but the plots of the novels are never as they were lived, and this is similarly. I mean, the Adam Posner character in this novel is a much better athlete than I was. But he has to be, because in the novel he's depicted as very fast, and part of the symbolism is that he was very much trying to run away from his home, but he couldn't get very far. But again, in all of the books, in Secondhand Smoke, Duncan Katz is a Nazi hunter, a prosecutor for the Justice Department. You remember I was on your show when that book came out. I'd never worked for the Justice Department. I've never been a Nazi hunter. I was a Wall Street lawyer for a number of years, but I was a child of survivors, and I understood, I understood the impulse of wanting to bring justice in the aftermath of such, incredible violations of crimes against humanity. I'm very much aware of the legacy and the consequences of genocide of the Jewish people. I mean, I've devoted a career, whether as a law professor for many years and a writer on themes dealing with Israel and anti-Semitism. That all of that was, I think, built into me as a child of survivors. But I'm not a historian or a political scientist, but I am an observer. I've written, scores, if not hundreds of essays over the last 20 years about Israel's position in the world, about Israel's dealings with terrorism, its wars against its neighbors to defend itself, the moral position that it's placed in. I've written, I've lectured throughout Israel about these ideas and have written widely and appeared on behalf of the Israeli government at a number of conferences or done, lectures for, people in the IDF. So I'm involved, but, again, mostly as an outside observer and never with portfolio, just as an outsider, teacher, writer, thinker. I just reviewed a book for the Washington Post last summer on you might have seen it, the Lawrence Wright book on the Camp David Accords. And he too points out how important it was that between the Egyptians and the Israelis and the Americans, that they were a team of backdoor, he was essentially referring to you, Leon, people who went back and forth between negotiating team. But Palestinians were very critical, as was Anwar Sadat after Camp David, that the Palestinian situation was not resolved at Camp David. And I think that President Carter still holds Israel responsible for not only ending up finding a resolution, but for continuing the settlement policy. The Israelis were tough negotiators, as you know, during Camp David, and Anwar Sadat saw himself as the prince of the Middle East, and he did not want to go back not having resolved the Palestinian situation, and yet he had to go back without really any guarantees about what would happen to the West Bank and Gaza. And I think one of the things that book I reviewed for the Washington Post last year seems to suggest is that Carter holds his own grudge today, that there was no further progress in the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians after this incredible success in bringing peace between the Egyptians and the Israelis. I think he believed that when both sides went back, that the spirit of Camp David would result in yet another round of diplomatic accords that granted statehood. In the book that I reviewed, Weitzman is depicted as being the one who is much more amenable to the peace agreement, that he was often pushing Menachem Begin to do more, that he was, that they didn't get along when it came to those negotiations, and that Weitzman was the one that, and I guess since you were his attorney during that time, if I remember, you were his counsel, his personal attorney, that, you must have been in the backdoor channels of watching Weitzman try to extract more concessions from Menachem Begin. So, last summer, the 50-day war in Gaza, I wrote 10 essays in 50 days. And there was a fair amount of backlash, certainly on social media for sure, where, I in fact even received death threats. It's very challenging both at university levels and also in intellectual magazines to defend Israel in any way or to hold Palestinians accountable at all for any of their conduct in dealing with the impasse with the Israelis in the West Bank and in Gaza. So yes, it was a challenging summer, but I did not serve in the IDF. I don't feel that it was a tremendous sacrifice to defend Israel in this way, and I felt very morally privileged to do so, especially since the nation comes under such attack from largely around the world, and so certainly even among Jewish writers, it's perhaps surprising or not surprising to hear how few of them actually write favorably about Israel.
Welcome to another Leon Charney report. First, we talked to Thane Rosenbaum, who's been on the show many times. He's a prolific writer. I would consider him one of the best of the new sort of Jewish breed of writers, the Saul Bellow types. And he's written a book called The Golems of Gotham. Thane, not everybody knows what a golem is, so tell us first of all what a golem is.
Well, actually, Leon, before we get to that, I understand that you came back from Israel this morning.
Correct.
Can you tell us, and certainly I'd like to hear what you saw?
Israel is in very tough shape right now. I think one of the most disturbing things that's happened is they found that the Palestinian Authority has been able to manufacture some kind of rocket, and they've been able to fire them into the Israeli territory. And there's a lot of fear that those rockets would attack big population centers in Israel. So I believe when I was leaving last night, Israel went into Gaza with their tanks and set up some kind of buffer zone. The talk in Israel is very dour. Shimon Peres, the foreign minister, is working with some on a peace plan, which nobody in the Knesset wants to back. Avram Burg, who is the speaker of the Knesset, wants to go to Ramallah and talk to the Palestinian National Council. Today there's a vote to take him out as speaker. So there's a little bit of anarchy anytime anybody makes a move one way or another. I was at a wedding the night, 2 nights ago. Probably all the ministers of the Likud were there. Bibi Netanyahu, Sharon missed it. He's suffering from a bad cold. And when you ask people what's going to happen, what's the future look like, nobody knows. I've come to a resolution myself, and I'll talk to you about it because you're pretty well informed. There are 13 million Jews in this world, and there are about 1 billion Muslims and a lot of Christians. And since September 11th, something has happened that has changed the balance of the world. This is Leon Charney talking. Saudi Arabia is not being a great friend to the United States today. They're playing two sides. The Israelis are very, very worried about Iran. I keep telling people, Elaine Chelino, who's a New York Times reporter, wrote a brilliant book about the faces of Persia. It's not a good place. Iran has been involved in that ship that the Americans and the Israeli intelligence both believe were funded through the Iranian government. They really believe that. So that's changed dramatically the whole concept of what's going on. Nobody in Israel, and I'm talking about individuals, not talking political people, believes that Arafat is capable of doing a peace plan with Israel. Nobody. I've said on this show numerous times that I believe Arafat is finished, that they will elevate him to a ceremonial position perhaps because he's indigenous to the cause of the Palestinians. But you can see, I don't know if the Americans saw it yesterday, Arafat picked up a gun and wanted to kill one of his chief defense characters called Rajub because he thought that the story was so mixed up but nobody knew. But what you see is pockets of anarchy in the Palestinian Authority. Now, what this means to the Israelis, it's unclear. But you see Arik Sharon talking to Palestinians other than Arafat. So people are trying to make a wedge. But what worries me is the economics. The hotels are not full. The banking is tough. People are not coming. And basically, economics bring down governments. Bibi Netanyahu, when he made a beeline at that wedding that night, you can see the politics. He's trying to take down Sharon, no matter what he says. So I give you a very confused picture. People are not very happy now. People are very upset about the suicide bombings, about the terrorism. And at the end of the day, I don't think it'll make a difference whether it's Bibi or not Bibi. I think that the national unity government will hold, but not for very long. I think there's going to have to be some splits.
What has to happen next to actually begin a new process?
The Americans have to come down very strongly and say to Arafat, you must accept the Tenet plan, which is George Tenet, the CIA director, and the Mitchell plan. And they have to start from that position. What worries me, and I think that the linchpin in the Middle East is really Egypt. And the funding in the United States is coming up. Egypt gets as much as Israel. They're the two greatest recipients of aid from the United States. I believe Mubarak would love to see this thing go away, but I think that what will happen next, there'll be a movement in Israel for unilateral separation. Aleph Bet Yehoshua, a very famous author, came out with a plan saying that separation is the only way to do it. But you don't have a consensus of how to go. What you have is terrorism. You have people who are afraid of suicidal terrorism.
Any moderates on the Palestinian side, either in the authority or elsewhere, that might be receptive to a plan that doesn't include the right of return?
There are a lot of, Nusseibeh, who's basically the minister of Jerusalem, has come out with a statement saying that he believes that ultimately these Palestinians would have to give up this concept of the right of return. On the other hand, he said that you'd have to take up the West Bank settlements. And that's an issue, that's an internal issue in Israel. That just somehow it's going to have to be resolved. It's going to have to. I know a lot of the political people. I know practically all the politicians in Israel, and some of them are optimistic, some are not optimistic. But one of my friends, very famous, I'm not going to mention his name, he's always optimistic. And today he said no. He said, I'm not optimistic. Today I'm a hawk. I'd like to go in and clean out that whole gang of terrorists in Gaza and clear it up. I
know you have strong relations actually with people. Whose show is this anyway? It looks like I'm talking to you about Israel, right. But I'm curious about
We give an informed public the
right
to know.
We're switching roles here.
It's all right.
I'm just curious. I know you have a lot of dealings with people in the Likud movement. Are there any voices among those politicians that are amenable to dismantling settlements?
No.
And
the quick answer is no.
That's a big problem. There's nobody on that side that wants to have that
No.
conversation.
In fact, it's a good question, because the more they talk about some kind of peace, the more hard, they're more hardened they become in that position. Now, Bibi Netanyahu is going to run on a platform of never giving up anything on the West Bank, on Jerusalem, etc., etc. And the Knesset can't move. But what's interesting is I know a lot of people on the Meretz, I know a lot of people in the Labor Party. Basically, when you see terrorism, it doesn't mean it's Likud or so you can't. There
You're saying everyone's united.
Everybody is practically united
when it comes to that.
When it comes to that, and that's what you're going to have. My guess is that if Bibi really challenges Sharon may move to form a center party, maybe with even the Labor Party. It's a far-fetched case. Yeah. Well, his parents were originally Labor Party people and all.
Because he,
in popularity, he's got about 65% popularity, but Bibi in the Central Committee takes him down by at least 50%.
So the point is he wouldn't go away easily.
No.
Right. Sorry to have changed the format of the program, but you know so much about Israel that I thought your viewers would want to hear your perspective.
Well, we want to prove that we're not golems.
Good segue.
So tell us what a golem is.
Well, it's actually a 16th century Czechoslovakian myth, a legend that is somewhat inspired by Jewish mysticism and the Kabbalah. During a period of violent pogroms against the Jews of Prague, Rabbi Loew decided to consult the Kabbalah and look at a way of rescue and protection. And there is a formula, a recipe for the making of the golem, a golem in the Kabbalah, in the Book of Jewish Mysticism. And the golem's entire mission, it's really the precursor. It was the inspiration for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Actually, Mary Shelley acknowledged that Frankenstein is largely based on the golem myth. Rabbi Loew went to one of the local rivers and took mud, and it's a monster. The golem is a monster made out of clay, a large creature without a soul, but with the physical appearance of a man, but a kind of early model Terminator, like Schwarzenegger style, very strong Jew, a fighting machine.
So would this be a good movie?
Yes.
Okay. Now, let me explain to the audience. Thane's been on my show many times, and he's written Elijah
Visible was my first book.
And the second one was?
Secondhand Smoke.
Secondhand Smoke. And I remember this to this day, he thought that many Jews ought to return to Poland and rehabilitate Poland, if I remember correctly. Is that correct?
Yeah, in Secondhand Smoke, one of the conceits of the novel was that Israel is the home of the biblical Jews,
Right.
but Poland was the home of the diasporan Jews. The largest center of Jewish concentration of art, culture, and population existed in Poland and in Warsaw. There were over 3 million Jews that lived in Poland before the Holocaust, and after the Holocaust, I think it was around 50,000. And then there was actually probably a little more, but then there were a few pogroms between 45 and 48, and then Jews basically left. And today, there's probably only 10,000 Jews in a country that once was the richest center of Jewish culture in the world. And one of the conceits of Secondhand Smoke, my second book, was that very idea of a reclaiming of a country, an actual both physical and spiritual return to Poland, a place where there was such a vibrant and vital Jewish culture that existed before the war.
When Ellen comes on with a book to pretend, I would suspect that Frankel, who now was espousing his Judaism, probably go to Poland and take you up on that. I don't think they're going to let him out.
Right. I think he's going to stay where he is, probably. But.
You are distinctly interested in the Holocaust, and we have to refresh our audience as to why.
Well, my parents were Holocaust survivors, and when I went off to become a fiction writer, I'm not sure if I intended to do this, but it seemed as if the stories that I told were post-Holocaust tales, books of moral philosophy that were both comedic, but at the same time painful, that spoke to the legacy of the post-Holocaust world and the hole that was left in all of us after Auschwitz. And so I guess I set out to write a post-Holocaust trilogy dealing with the aftermath of Auschwitz, the legacy of the camps and the legacy of survivors and their children, and the way that it affected damaged lives. And so all the books, although have their own commercial appeal and have humorous moments, the shadow of the Holocaust hovers over all of them, the way in which the books are all contemporary, all three novels. This is a novel, though, although I invoke the legend of the Golem, it's set on the Upper West Side in the year 2000. It's a millennial tale in which all of Manhattan becomes inhabited by ghosts, 8 ghosts in particular, 6 of whom were former Holocaust survivors who were also memoirists, all of whom committed suicide. Jerzy Kosinski, Primo Levi, Tadeusz Borowski, Paul Celan, Jean Amoret, and Piotr Ravish. It's one of these little-known things about the Holocaust art, which is that Holocaust survivors, by and large, rebuilt their lives. And although they suffered from some despair and dysfunction, there was very little suicide in the lives of Holocaust survivors. The writers, on the other hand...
Primo Levi was a suicidal?
Yeah.
Really?
The writers, the memoirists, the artists, the novelists, overwhelmingly killed themselves.
What's the line that you see in that?
Well, the novel takes the position, in a way, because again, all these characters are resurrected through a Kabbalah experiment.
Right.
And it's essentially the Golems of Gotham are these 6 writers, and the dead parents of the writer who is in this book. And his daughter, it's basically a ghost story that's set on the Upper West Side on Edgar Allan Poe Street, of all places, in which a child using an ancient klezmer violin that she suddenly and mysteriously and magically knows how to play better than anyone in the world, reenacts the Kabbalah, the experiment of creating a golem. And in doing so, she resurrects her grandparents and these 6 writers who live in the house and haunt the Upper West Side and change the character of the neighborhood, actually turn Manhattan into a Jewish shtetl, even more so than it is today. And bring a sense of Jewish renewal, Jewish spirituality back, and also sort of play antic tricks on sort of the community. They're actually fun-loving ghosts, these Golems of Gotham. And the conceit is that, you see, all of these writers killed themselves without leaving a suicide note. So in some ways, I felt compelled to resurrect them and to actually explain perhaps why it is that they died.
Wow. All right, we got to cut for a break. The book is The Golems of Gotham. The author is Thane Rosenbaum. He's brilliant, very deep, and obviously very concerned about Judaism and Jews, and obviously what the Holocaust has done to the Jewish people. And we'll continue, get some more depth of thought from Thane. We'll be right back. We're back. I'm talking with Thane Rosenbaum, who, in my opinion, is a phenomenal, brilliant writer, period. Happens to be a Jewish writer, too, so that makes him, I guess, doubly great. I don't know. We'll figure it out. We have a lot of non-Jewish authors, too, but he's written this book called The Golems of Gotham. It's really a story about the West Side and the Holocaust. And I asked Thane before the break why these famous writers all committed suicide without notes, Primo Levi and Brzezinski. I mean, why?
Well, the novel takes the position, again, it's a work of imagination, because
Right.
you know, it is to me an enormous post-Holocaust mystery. It's something that no one has really put together, linked the fact that
true.
this extraordinary coincidence that all of them at various different points in various countries, you know, Ravitch killed himself in France, Paul Celan in Germany, Primo Levi in Italy, Jerzy Kosinski here in New York, Jean Amery in Belgium. I mean, it's an international cast of famous Holocaust survivor, writer, memoirist, novelists, and poets who, at the end of the day, killed themselves, and even though they were writers, they left wordlessly without explaining why. The novel, I guess, takes the position that there is this moral imperative to remember and to acknowledge the enormity of the Holocaust. But if you spend perhaps too much time with it, this kind of ongoing obsession leads to madness. You come,
Right.
in fact, the myth, the Icarus, Greek myth of Icarus of flying too close to the sun is invoked in the novel. This idea that these were men who didn't come out enough, perhaps, that they lived too much as artists, too close to the fire of the camps, that they continually thought about it and lived it even in their aftermath as writers and as people, and survivors who returned to rebuild and to start over and to begin new families, perhaps were focused on something else. I mean, Elie Wiesel, as we know, thank
I'm
God.
going to talk about Elie. Was
He's
on
in the
this
book.
show. Elie was on the show, and he said to me, "You know, I'm a professor and I teach, and I'm not doing that much more on the Holocaust." And he is probably the most prominent or preeminent personality who writes about the Holocaust. I think you're right. You get to a point where if you keep studying and going, you go mad. You absolutely go mad.
Well, Elie Wiesel actually makes a cameo in the book. The ghosts confront him. He can't see them. The only people that can see them are this mystery writer and his daughter, who live in this brownstone on Edgar Allan Poe Street.
He wrote a book called Beggar in Jerusalem.
Yeah. My favorite of his books that people don't know is a book called The Gates of the Forest. He did another book that I loved, The Fifth Son. You know, he's so identified with his Holocaust memoir, Night, but the truth is that I think he should be also equally known for some of his fiction, and I think that's an unfortunate thing. What's happened to him is that he's become, as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, he's often thought of as a humanist and a human rights spokesperson, and in many ways a Jewish political figure. And I think people lose sight of the fact that he's essentially an artist, and that I think is forgotten. But yeah, he makes a cameo because perhaps one of the themes, one of the ideas that the novel raises is that maybe it's precisely the activities of the full litany of activities in Elie Wiesel's plate that made him different from these other men.
Your parents alive?
No.
Your parents' friends? Do they read Holocaust survivors? Do they read books on the Holocaust? Well, that's too general a question.
You know, it's a tough thing. People, I think, make more assumptions that my readers are survivors and their children, and I find in the letters that I get that that's not necessarily true, that non-Jews read, especially in more recent aspects of American multicultural literature. I fall into that odd category of a unique American experience, and so I'm read oftentimes with Cuban American writers and African American writers, that what I do seems so exotic, writing about the experiences of the post-Holocaust world from an American Jew's perspective. But Holocaust survivors, you know, they read, fiction and nonfiction, and the stories of this kind are different. The kind of work that I've been doing for years is unusual. Most people think Holocaust, both fiction and nonfiction, deals with 1939 to 45. So I don't touch that time. I actually
post.
Yeah, I never touch. My stuff is very contemporary. It really, the Holocaust looms large as a backdrop, as an inspiration, but it really is contemporary. And this is a millennial I mean, Zabar's is in this book. The Central Park Carousel is in this book. The lighting of the Christmas tree in Rockefeller Center is in this book. Carnegie Hall there's a concert that is in this book. Sort of a takeoff on Mayor Giuliani is in this book. This is not a book that's written in Warsaw in 1941.
So it's a contemporary book.
But the Holocaust always figures large in my imagination.
I'm going to be very simplistic for a minute. I say the word to you, Holocaust. What does it mean?
Huge hole, huge fire. An enormous 2 out of every 3 Jews of Europe were killed, one of 3 out of 3 of the entire Jewish population. Imagine for a moment, 2 out of every 3 Jews over a 6-year period was vanished, wiped off the face of the continent of Europe. The enormity, the speed, the efficiency of that death of those murders are extraordinary. And that is a hole and a contaminant that Jews will never dig themselves out of. The world will never dig themselves out of. It's too enormous. The magnitude is too large. And yet, the burden which this novel really speaks to is the burden is ongoing moral imperative to remember and to acknowledge properly and not to trivialize and not to treat in an offensive way, to actually keep a sense of the Holocaust present at all times. And yet, to keep it too present is dangerous. There's a risk of memory. And we all have that. We all suffer loss.
Have you ever studied the, let's say, post-Holocaust reaction of the Pope or the Vatican?
There's an unbelievable book coming out in the fall by my friend Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, who wrote Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans, and the Holocaust. And he has a new book coming out in the fall that, if you're interested in this subject about the ongoing relationship of the Catholic Church and its contribution to the Holocaust, it's going to be remarkable. I guarantee you it's going to be the biggest book in the fall. And maybe you get him on the show, because if you're interested in the subject, it's going to be the definitive book about this.
Well, I'm always curious, and a lot of people are, and there's a lot of history being written and rewritten about the Vatican's position during the Holocaust.
It's abominable.
Yeah, well, it's obviously the worst, but...
the institution with the greatest moral authority to assist people who were being slaughtered, and not just Jews, completely remained complicit and silent, and functioned in many ways as collaborationists in order to save itself, and to, in many ways, serve a position that they might have agreed with. And yet it's the contribution, the green light that Hitler got from the Catholic Church is extraordinary.
What's to prevent another Holocaust?
Look, there are people, Leon, I bet you're one of them, who thinks Israel is one way. But I think that the lesson of the Holocaust is a lesson that we've learned in Rwanda and Serbia and Bosnia and Cambodia, which is that
continues.
Human beings are extremely efficient, maniacal killers when we want to be. And if we want to eliminate people for their sole crime of existence, we can do that quite well, and we do.
How does a conscience allow that?
Well, a lot of people have a lot of interesting things to say about that, which is that it requires a kind of distancing of the moral mindset. I mean, that you can, in an odd way, I hate to invoke a show that doesn't have much to do with the Leon Charney program, but The Sopranos is a very good example in a small way about the idea that you can split off the killing aspect of your life from the domestic aspect of your life.
It's an interesting metaphor.
Well, that's what The Sopranos seems to me about. It's that they're worried about their children and their mothers, and they're worried about making sure that the kids go to the proper colleges, and at the same time they're in the murder business. There's this presumption that killers are always engaged in death. But
the mob always has wonderful church funerals.
Absolutely. The mob is, in many ways incredibly moral when it comes to certain values. And when it comes to other values, they're hard.
So you're saying one can compartmentalize his mind and leave moral judgments to different rationalizations.
The moral sphere of our existence can be cut off from our public professional sphere so that we see it as a job. Death becomes a job, it's a task, a function that we seek to perform, and that we can go home and recite poetry and listen to music and make sure the kids get to sleep on time, because we live in a culture and in a world that allows us to split off our moral sphere from our public and professional sphere. And actually, I have a new book coming out in a year, because I'm also a law professor, actually speaks about the way the legal system does that all the time. As you know, as a lawyer, the legal system is always interested in achieving correct legal results regardless of moral consequences. Those people who are not lawyers oftentimes look at the legal system and wonder why it doesn't feel emotionally right, what's happening. And the reason for that, people who aren't lawyers are thinking about right and wrong and what feels right morally. And lawyers never have moral considerations. It's purely achieving correct legal results. And it's the same idea. Killers are thinking simply about their task, and it's split from their moral
While I got your brilliant mind, I'm split away from the golems for a minute. And let's talk about the law business that you're talking about. The Supreme Court, when it ruled for George Bush, was that political, moral? What happened?
You know, one of my friends at the law school, Abner Green, actually just wrote a book about this, so we would defer to him, but he actually did write a fine book about this. But, you know, it's hard for people, I think, not to see that as a politically motivated decision. It's just very hard when you see the breakdown of the court and see how it is that they voted and see who the ultimate outcome, the ultimate winner is. And so the question really becomes for people who I suspect who are not law professors and wondering, you know, who did the Supreme Court serve in that instance? Were they serving the will of the people, right? I mean, here's actually raising a very good question. I might have to think about putting it in my book. People on the outside who aren't lawyers, who aren't thinking about how to explain this legally, are simply saying, who got more votes? Really, isn't that simple? Who just got most votes? Isn't that really the right thing?
Right.
Who got more votes? All of the other splitting hairs, the minutiae, very much in the world of legal technicalities, very narrow, specific look or view of how to render that decision. But the moral answer is simply, all right, it's like first grade, right? Who got more votes? At the end of the day, who really won? So again, this is yet another example about the way those outside the legal system look at the legal system and don't feel emotionally right. It doesn't feel right to them emotionally about what's happening. And so
I happen to agree with you, and I you know, and I taught law, and I do teach once in a while. Somehow I get to the phrase that justice is the best deal you can make as quickly as possible, because I don't think there is any theoretical justice, and the Golems probably prove that in many different ways.
well, the Golems of Gotham is really a book of moral philosophy, and although it's comedic, and I hope to think it's entertaining, it's a real book about.
Got to be pretty brilliant to write a comedic book about moral philosophies. Only a guy like Thane Rosenbaum can do it. Anyway, we're running out of time with Thane. He's probably going to be running around doing his new book. Thane, we thank you for coming on. I just got to say that if it's a Rosenbaum book, I think it's a must-read. So hopefully everybody will tell us that they've read about the golem, and my producer now knows what a golem was. He never knew before.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks a million for coming.
Always grateful to be here,
Thane.
Leon. Thank you.